Mr. Chair, I believe Mr. Peterson is going to be trying to call in remotely on his phone. So we'll hopefully get his call momentarily.
Okay, are we ready to go?
We currently have 3 of the 5 members present. That does mean we would have a quorum.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to the May CVTA Finance Committee meeting. Again, it's a pleasure to see everyone gathered here virtually. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I'm ready to get going. So with that, I know you all have already received a statement regarding virtual meetings in your package that came before you before today's meeting. Ms. Mueller, I think we should go ahead and initiate the roll call and certify the quorum if we have it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good morning. Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson. Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Present.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Present.
Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Present.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller. Now we'll move on to item 1 on our agenda today. It's the consideration of amendments to the action meeting agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, those in support of the agenda before us, vote by saying aye.
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 Aye. The ayes have it. The agenda is approved. We'll move on to item number 2, the approval of the April 14th, 2021 CVTA Finance Committee action meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the Finance Committee minutes?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
There is a motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 The ayes have it. The motion is approved to approve of the minutes. Moving on to item 3, the open public comment period. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to offer comments via email or in person? Mr. Parsons, has anyone sent anything in?
No, sir. There's no questions remotely.
All right, we have no questions for remotely, no public comments. So we'll move on to item 4, the CVTA Finance Committee Committee Chairman's report. Once again, good morning to everyone, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. All I have is I look forward to another productive meeting of the Finance Committee meeting. This is an essential committee for the new CVTA, and I'm grateful for the participation of all my friends from the region to ensure that we have the best transportation authority in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we'll now move on to item 5, CVTA activities report. I'll hand it over to Ms. Heater, Mr. Parsons, and Mr. Uri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, this morning we've included another update on the financial activities. So this is the same format that you saw last month, again, summarizing the revenues that have been received attributed to the months and the distributions associated with that. You'll see then, let's see if I can scroll down a little bit. You'll see there then at the bottom, the balances have been cleared for the GRTC and the local distributions. So we are up to date and current on revenues collected and dispersed for those 2 allocated funds. Of course, the revenues for the operating funds are being drawn as costs incur, and you can see there that we do have quite a bit remaining on the $500,000 set aside, and then of course the whole of the revenues for the set aside for regional projects. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any, and certainly I think Chesterfield County staff always want to give thanks and gratitude to Debbie Basie and team for putting together this report.
I want to thank the staff as well for their contributions here as well. Any questions on the finance activities report? All right, we'll move on to the TAC update. Mr. Uri.
Morning, thank you, Mr. Chair. The CVTA TAC held a meeting this past Monday, May 10th. We covered a number of items, including spending plans, which is on your agenda this morning to talk about in more detail. We also took action to approve the certification reporting document that will be used for confirmation by all the member localities on the spending at the end of the fiscal year. We also had an update and presentation from GRTC in conjunction with Jarrett Walker and Associates on the draft regional public transportation plan. That effort is continuing to move forward, and we should be getting a draft document to review shortly. And we also had an update on the transit service governance report. There was a subcommittee meeting of the transit governance group last Friday, and that effort is also continuing forward. They're wrapping up with the deadline of having the report ready to submit and review by the CVTA by beginning of next month, with submission of the report to the governor and General Assembly by July 1st. That's the end of my report. Be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Uri. Any questions on the for the TAC update or for Mr. Uri?
But Mr. Chairman, this is Carlos Brown. I did have
Brown.
a question. So, Mr. Uri, when is it expected that you will have not just the kind of a prioritization process finalized, but also the first round of projects scored into that process? What's the expectation about that timeline?
Yes, thank you for that question, Mr. Brown. And actually, I failed to mention, we did have an update on the regional prioritization process. That group is continuing to meet as a subcommittee. The last meeting was, I believe, a week or two ago. We're not meeting this Friday. They have a standing 2-week meeting, but at this point, I've put it back to the CVTA and NRVA staff to do some test runs of some of the candidate projects to see how the modeling exercise works. I'll defer to Chet as far as when that effort will be done. And once they're through that effort, the subcommittee will get back together, meet, and work on continuing to prioritize that list of projects. So in answer to your question, Mr. Brown, I anticipate by early to mid-June, we will be mostly done with that draft process. I'll look to Chet to see if he has any further thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Uri. We it is on the agenda later on this morning, but the estimation is that the process itself is being drafted right now and will be complete in a final draft for review by the end of May. And then there will be a short window after that to actually, once the process is approved, to actually bring back candidate projects and scored and ranked. So I think it may take another week, 2 tops, once the process is complete. So I think the early to mid-June is a reasonable estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Uri? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to old business. Item 6, the CVTA staffing and support services for fiscal year 2022. I'll hand it over to Ms. Heater.
Thank you. I first wanted to just let everyone know that Mr. Peterson is here. He's on the line by phone, and just was working with him for a moment on being able to unmute himself. So if you'll just bear with me. Nicole, I'm not sure. I don't seem to have the controls to be able to unmute him, but if you could look at that. But Mr. Peterson is here and wanted me to let everyone know that. As for the item, thank you for that introduction. Last month at our meeting, we did include a set of content for what a renewal agreement would look like. We have since taken that content and incorporated it into a revised agreement effective July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. We've included in your packet the current agreement marked up to reflect that renewal for a new 12-month term, as well as additional language that is more fitting to the activities that would be likely undertaken in second year of operation for the CVTA. So I can run through this fairly briefly if you like, or if committee members have already had a chance to review it, I don't need to belabor. What would be the pleasure of the committee?
I would believe that it would be probably helpful to run through these as quickly as you can, Ms. Heater.
Sure, absolutely. So the first section is just around the compensation. So we've just updated that language to be more fitting with the financial practices that we've adopted. And so here we've got the compensation schedule as part of our annual budget process, which you adopted at the full authority last meeting. Total compensation is aligned with the budget at $210,000, a not to exceed figure. We would invoice the authority only for costs incurred, and that includes our personnel costs, associated fringe and indirect, and that 10% administration fee. Similarly, we have incorporated in here language that references Plan RVA's commitment to be able to essentially cash advance expenditures of the CVTA. That has been identified as part of our process flow mapping for processing expenditures. It's much easier for the staff at the city and Chesterfield County to process, the invoices in bulk. So we'll handle the intermediary invoices and then bill everything through for quarterly reimbursement. The list of types of expenditures that may be included are all listed here. The only addition there is the member stipends. As you know, most of you have submitted your paperwork for that. And so those will be in process of coming and would continue to be processed that way. And then finally, we just have included the reference to the quarterly reimbursement process and the documentation, and all of that is aligned with the financial management policies and procedures that have been adopted now. As far as the support services, not a lot of change here, just really, again, bringing in an alignment to the new arrangements that we have with the city and the county in their fiscal agent agreements and the roles that each of the support staff members are playing in the process. And then finally, we did reference, just because we are farther along in the process as far as the scenario planning tool, we know that there's still open discussion about how much alignment there will be between the CVTA's prioritization process and the TPO's prioritization process. So we've tried to incorporate language that is left open, and then have also incorporated language to make clear that CVTA has the ability to access Plan RVA's on-call bench of providers for public engagement and outreach services to the extent that that's necessary or desired. The two exhibits or appendices to the agreement have been updated to establish a new set of deliverables for the upcoming fiscal year. The first year's deliverables were very much targeted around startup activities. We're obviously moving into a very different phase in the next fiscal year. And so these are really focused more on what we anticipate from the staff perspective to be some critical objectives. And I think probably nearer to the end of the list here, item I, facilitating your deliberation on, long-term executive leadership needs. I think we've opened that discussion. We're going to have more conversation today as a follow-up to the authority meeting from April and the presentations from Mr. Page and Ms. Bachman, but we certainly know that that's a priority for this coming year to sort of settle that issue. And the key performance indicators have been left largely unchanged. So that's the hopefully brief enough summary of the MOU. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if there are any additions or suggestions to the content, we'd be very happy to incorporate that. The recommended or requested action this morning is that the Finance Committee take action to forward this to the full authority for approval at the May full authority meeting.
Are there any questions or further suggestions for Ms. Heater?
Mr. Chairman, this is Canova Peterson. I just want to make sure you can hear me now.
I can see you, but I can't see that face of yours.
Well, I can't see
I can
yours
hear
either,
you.
sir, and I miss seeing everybody else's, but I'm multitasking today.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll let you multitask and you follow along, and we'll keep the agenda moving here. Okay. So,
Okay.
any questions or further suggestions from Ms. Heater?
One brief comment, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I noticed, we didn't catch this originally, but on page 1, the amended whereas clause there at the bottom of the page, I believe it should say for fiscal year 2022. Instead
Yes,
of
you are correct.
21.
Thank you for
So
catching
just-
that.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't catch it before, but there you go.
Let's make that edit there. Good catch. We got anything else? All right, then, with seeing nothing else, I will now ask for a motion to forward this to the full body of the draft of this fiscal year 2022 Support Services Memorandum of Understanding.
I make the motion.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Peterson has moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded as well. I believe this requires a roll call vote. So Ms. Mueller.
Thank you. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
And CTB, Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller. Now move on to item 7, the fiscal year 2022 spending plans. Mr. Parsons.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I am sharing my screen. Mr. Peterson, we are talking about the CVTA FY22 local spending plans. This is really an update, and it's an information item for you this morning. The TAC met on Monday and discussed this for the first time. This is a non-binding document that provides a preview of what each locality in the region plans to do with their local revenues from the CVTA. And this is really a kind of a safeguard to show that all the expenditures are used for the purposes that are outlined in the code. We did this in FY21. Granted, it was late in the year. It was actually, I believe, early in calendar year 21, so just a few months ago. But we are trying to get on schedule so that this local allocation plan is in place for the start of fiscal year 22. So we have asked each locality to submit their estimated projects and details on those projects as much as possible so that we can document those and the authority can take action to accept the list. And it includes, as we learned last year, there are many different types of projects that could be funded, anywhere from a straight up construction project to funding staffing for transportation personnel or programmatic funds that continue over year to year. So the list, as you can see, right now it's incomplete. We have submissions from some of our member jurisdictions, but some are still in process. And we plan to fill this out before the TAC meets again in June, where a final recommendation will be made to come back to the authority. But just going from left to right across the screen, it basically shows the jurisdiction, the name of the project, any description that can be provided, the type of project, and further explanation if necessary, an estimated total cost, and then the proposed CVTA funds that are being used, any future CVTA funds that might be needed, other committed funds to show leveraging and opportunities to bring multiple sources into the construction or project funding process, and then the remaining funds needed. And the hope is that this can be used year to year and updated as needed to reflect progress and show that CVTA funds are being put to good use. We do have in FY21 the TAC approved a process where this list could be updated quarterly. So as progress is made throughout the year, we can provide updates and changes to the local allocation plan. And that has happened. We actually took action on a couple items on Monday to update. I believe it was City of Richmond and Henrico County projects that have seen changes. So I think it's working well, and we'll certainly be able to adjust this as needed if any new findings or discoveries are made as we go through fiscal year 22. I think this is what kind of the front end of the project tracking process. So at the beginning of each fiscal year, we'd like to have this local allocation plan set in place by the authority. And then at the end of each year, we have a local certification. And that's a separate one-page document that each locality will sign off on to certify that the funds that they have spent through the local revenue collection have gone towards transportation projects. And I think the two of these together, and Mr. Gregory, if there are any other legal questions to answer, I think the two of these documents together satisfy the code and provide a good documentation that the CVTA funds are being spent for the purposes they've set forward to do. I think that's it for my presentation. If there's any questions, certainly welcome to answer those, and we'll look to bring this finalized list back to you at a future meeting.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Gregory?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with all of Mr. Parsons' comments and appreciate his summary. The local, as Mr. Ure mentioned earlier as well, the certification instrument which we prepared has been approved by the TAC earlier this week on Monday, and so that's in good shape, we believe. It's been circulated also to the local legal counsel for their review, along with the MOA, which the draft MOA, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. So we got comments from local legal counsel on both of those documents. All those suggested changes have been incorporated into the certification instrument. So again, that's in good shape. So we believe that all of these documents and reporting mechanisms taken together will satisfy the requirements of the legislation.
All right. Any further questions or comments from Mr. Parsons regarding the FY 2022 spending plans?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Parsons, maybe Mr. Gregory. I'm just wondering, as we're going forward, does the present structure allow for maximum flexibility, particularly since we have, different types of localities? And what I'm suggesting here is that, when you look at the structure of the CVTA, you have different size counties there. So we want to make sure that we have the maximum flexibility with all type of funding allocation, so that there can be flexibility if needed for some of the smaller localities. So is anything, Mr. Gregory, deleterious about that approach?
No, sir, I don't think so. I think we've built into the compliance and reporting mechanisms and documents and instruments as much flexibility as the code allows for all of the member jurisdictions. They have the flexibility they need to spend the money on transportation projects, which may range from road building and bridges to bike trails or walking paths or sidewalks or transit. All of those things are permissible, and each locality member will be fully empowered to spend their funds on those types of projects, and also participate in the regional funding decisions. So we believe that that has been addressed. Yes, sir. And will continue to be a priority going forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Chairman, following up on Mr. Thornton's question, I'm just looking at scanning the list, and I noticed that line item number 12, Henrico, it just simply says unallocated funds, 18,500,000. So effectively, any of the jurisdictions could choose to propose their plan in that manner, thereby not necessarily having to declare at the adoption of the plan exactly which projects they would execute. But I guess at the end of the year, they would need to reconcile before the certification exactly what the allocation or those dollars were used for. Is that the thought?
Yes, Mr. Brown, that is correct. This is Chet Parsons. And there was a significant discussion on Monday at the TAC about line 12 specifically. So I believe that TAC did decide that listing unallocated funds may not be the best way to move forward. But in the FY21 plan, many of the jurisdictions, I believe Hanover, Ashland, Charles City, all showed that just listed in the allocation plan that they had no intention of spending funds this year. But that's, again, this is a non-binding document. It could be updated on a quarterly basis, and you are correct. The certification instrument at the end of the year is where the reconciliation needs to take place. That if funds were spent, they need to be documented in this plan.
Chair.
Any further questions?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Carroll has a question.
Mr. Carroll.
Two things. Number one, can we make sure that we share this Excel spreadsheet with the members of the Finance Committee? I didn't see this email to me ahead of the meeting. And number two, I think also something to consider is that at the end of the year, when we do the certification, it may be a jurisdiction that didn't spend all of their funds, and they should be able to, and if I'm asking this question, they should be able to carry those funds over. And in the next year, they're going to have to show the justification on the use of those funds. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is correct. And that discussion took place on Monday at the TAC as well. We'll be happy to share this draft document for FY22. I will just note that at this time we only have 3 jurisdictions listed, so it will be updated over the next month. But we'll be happy to share it out.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Canova Peterson.
Mr. Peterson.
I've got, following up on Mr. Carroll's question there, is there any limitation in the legislation as to how long any jurisdiction can accumulate their funds before they use them?
Mr. Chairman, I'll try to take that if I may. The short answer is no. The statute does not set forth any sort of time limitations on the expenditure of funds by member jurisdictions. They would roll over. And there's explicit language in the statute that states that any money accumulated in the CVTA fund established under the legislation will not roll over into the state's general fund. So it will accumulate there, then be distributed by the comptroller to the CVTA, and those funds will be held or distributed to the localities, or in the case of the regional projects, held by the CVTA until they're directed to be spent. And then the regional members or the locality members can accumulate funds under the statute. There's no limitation as far as I'm aware.
Any further questions? Mr. Parsons, you did so well with the spending plans update for fiscal year 2022. I'm going to hand it over to you to do the regional project prioritization update for the budget.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. This was discussed briefly earlier this morning, but I wanted to share just a few details, more specific details on how the project prioritization discussion is moving forward. And first of all, I think there's a significance to eligibility for types of projects that can be funded with the 35% regional fund. We started the discussion with all 267 projects that are currently identified as regionally significant by the RTPO. And that is the full breadth of projects that are needed, the project needs across the region. The subcommittee understood that this list of projects is probably too broad, and there needs to be some more fine-tuned definition of projects that are eligible for CVTA funds and to be designated as free regional projects. So I've shared on my screen the eligibility criteria that the subcommittee has developed, and this is going into the process document right now. So the first bullet on there the first project type is highway and bridge, and this is going to be the types of projects that are eligible.
Excuse me, Mr. Parsons. Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Peterson may need to go on mute in order. I think we're getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, we are getting some feedback there. Is there any way you can mute your line, Mr. Peterson?
I will try to do that. Hold on one second. And
Mr. Chair, members, when Mr. Peterson mutes his own line, we don't see the indication. If we mute him, he cannot unmute himself. So if he controls his own mute and unmute, then he'll be able to speak when he wants to, and otherwise leave it on mute to avoid the feedback.
But it won't be, there will be no indicator on the screen that he's muted. Is that what you're saying, Ms. Heater?
Yes, sir, that's right.
Got it. Well, the feedback has been eliminated, so I think we've mute.
Mr. Chairman, I stopped my vehicle and put it on mute for a second, so that solved that. If we can do this, as we have a topic, finish the topic. I'll let Nicole mute me, but unmute me when you finish the topic so I can have an opportunity to say something.
Okay, that works. Ms. Mueller, can you handle that?
Yes, sir, I sure can.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll resume.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was mentioning, the eligibility criteria, first of all, is highway and bridge, and limited access roadways like interstates and freeways. All of those types of projects are eligible for funds. And then when you move down the list of functional classification, arterial roadways are next with existing roadways. And the subcommittee decided that the higher capacity roads that experience greater than 20,000 vehicles per day would qualify to be eligible for CVTA regional funds. And this is coming from the VDOT functional classifications and the most recent traffic counts that are published. Then when you get to new alignments, it's up to each locality to justify inclusion based on what the expected functional class would be, the projected traffic volumes within 20 years, and an estimate of reduction in volumes in any adjacent arterials due to rerouted traffic. And then on the bottom of the page there, intersection projects are eligible, but it needs to be an intersection of two arterials, at least one leg with the threshold of 20,000 vehicles per day. So all of these are basically eligible projects need to show high traffic volumes, major impacts, and more significant impacts from use of CVTA regional funds. And I have two more slides. Other project types that are eligible for regional funds are bicycle and pedestrian projects, but it's limited to regional trail networks such as the Fall Line and the East Coast Greenway. Ideally, these projects would be multi-jurisdictional and would have a defined or conceptual alignment already in place. The next project type is rail projects. And the limit here is to leverage funds or local match funds for other federal and state sources. And these are for capacity and facility rail projects like intercity passenger rail or station upgrades. And the discussion here was that rail projects are so terribly expensive that the best use of CVTA regional funds is to provide that match or the leverage capability that would take a project over the top in terms of receiving federal or state funds from other sources. The next project type is intermodal, and these include park and ride lots and port projects for the Richmond Marine Terminal. And then finally, the transit project type. And this, again, there's a limit to leveraging funds or local match funds for other state and federal sources and for regional capital transit projects, such as BRT infrastructure, major transfer center construction, or park and ride lots, as mentioned under intermodal. Again, major capital improvements and using CVTA funds to leverage those amounts. And then just a flavor of projects. The subcommittee wanted to, before a full test of possible projects was done, the subcommittee, each member was asked to provide just their best impression of what a major regional project might be. And this list was developed by the subcommittee to test out the prioritization process, and see which projects would meet the eligibility criteria that I just presented. So these projects are being prioritized by Plan RVA and TPO staff to be tested as a non-binding test case for the project criteria and the ranking process. And this is what the subcommittee is using to confirm that the process is sound and will provide the ranking, prioritization, and benefit cost details that the authority needs to be able to approve a prioritized list of projects for each fiscal year. So I guess in closing, this list is not comprehensive. It is a test case and is intended to provide feedback to the subcommittee to determine whether the process is complete and ready to move forward for full ranking. As I mentioned earlier, the timeline is that we expect to have the testing done and the drafting of the testing of these projects and the drafting of the process to be finished by the end of May. And then it may take 2 weeks into June to fully test all the rest of the projects that are eligible and provide a draft priority list back to the TAC and the authority. This is a lot of information, but I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
A lot of information indeed, but I know we have an inquisitive committee here, so we'll open up any questions. Any questions for Mr. Parsons?
Mr. Parsons, this is Carlson. Well, I'll defer to Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, listed to some other things, and we're ranking these. I'm concerned that sounds like some of the criteria we're using may eliminate some of the smaller jurisdictions from consideration. I think we need to be careful with that. But secondly, I know this is taking time and we're still in the birthing process of this organization, but we also have current distributions that we need to look at. And I think that we all know we have basically a shovel-ready project in the fall line, ready to go. But that affects 5 jurisdictions, not all 9. As such, I'm wondering, should we recommend to the full committee that our administrators and managers and their finance people bring back something so that for this first year at least, to distribute these funds in a way that equitable way, to jurisdictions. With 5, I mean, the major part of it going to the fall line. Throw that out there for discussion.
So, Mr. Chairman, this is Carl Stern, and I actually can shed some light on that. I actually had a meeting yesterday with Hanover, Henrico, Chesterfield, and the City of Richmond's administrators or managers, as the case may be, to talk about that in conjunction with the next round of Smart Scale. And there was collective support that the Fall Line Trail would be a great opportunity to a great significant regional project that touches all the jurisdictions. And so at the CTB level, we're going to do what we can do to try to help advance that. And I think there's thoughts that the CVTA could also help push that along. And I think the comment was made that recognizing that there are 4 or 5 jurisdictions that are not impacted by the Fall Line Trail, the concept was maybe I think the request has already gone out. What are some other options or opportunities that the other jurisdictions that are not impacted by the Fall Line Trail would like to see in this first round? So Mr. Peterson, that request has gone out. I think the managers have heard that sentiment from both the CVTA and their leadership, and I think they're working and collaborating on that. So I think that process is underway. I guess the question I had, Mr. Parsons, laid to this was, so you're going to come back with a recommended prioritization, but are you also going to recommend kind of a funding scenario? And the distinction being, Mr. Chairman, that the prioritization, the TPO has done that, Plan RVA has done that. That is a process that is done every year to prioritize projects. The challenge has been that there's never been money, right, to fund the projects. And so now you have that added layer of complexity of, okay, we have the priority. Now, how do we actually execute the projects, over some period of time, recognizing the dollars we have available? And again, this will probably segue into the bonding conversation or, the decision not to bond, which is self-fund. But I think it's challenging to talk about the prioritization without talking about actually how you would execute, because the likelihood is that any 1 or 2 of these projects would likely exhaust the regional fund allocation for any given year. So unless you're going to just go through them sequentially, you're going to have a broader model. And then, of course, are there going to be opportunities for the stacking of dollars? For example, if there's a project, for example, one of the interstate projects that could get some funding from Smart Scale or one of the interstate funds that was recently adopted, and then you can layer in some regional dollars from the CVTA, and then maybe it's hitting a jurisdiction that's a part of the CVTA, so that jurisdiction decides to layer in additional dollars. Well, now, although it may only require $20 million of the CVTA regional fund, you can fund a $75 million project because you're stacking all those items together, and that requires a very complex ballet between the state, the region, and the locality. So I'll pause there and see if someone can answer that compound question.
Yes, sir, Mr. Brown. That's you are correct on all fronts. I think that the beauty of this process as an administrator is that we are concurrently developing the long range plan, which includes all possible projects, not just a subset. And part of that requirement is to segregate those projects into time bands in terms of implementation. So we have a more comprehensive view of the projects and when they could be constructed, and that this year will include CVTA dollars. So it gives kind of a broader perspective on what can be done. But I think you're absolutely correct that there's a lot of intricacy in developing the funding outlook when you are combining multiple sources. And part of what the subcommittee is trying to do right now is provide sizable chunks of projects to consider from time to time. And that will include, as much as to the extent possible, recommendations on which projects should go and when. The leveraging and the debt service conversation, I think will have to take place next, and we'll certainly need some outside input on the best way to incorporate that in the process. But the goal right now is to get the process in place so that the authority can make decisions with as much possible information as they can get, but also in a timely fashion. I did want to go back to Mr. Peterson's comment, Mr. Chair, if I can quickly. And I think as in my role as administrator of this process, our goal is to provide the information and meet the needs of the code, which means we do have to have the process in place and provide the kind of the baseline recommendations that meet that process. And then the way things work is the authority then has the ability to decide if projects should be set forth in rank order based on the process, or if there are other factors that need to adjust where the priority should be. So I think you'll have the background in June to make the best decision that you can make, but it's not binding. I mean, you all have the ability to change that process and update the rankings according to the best information that you have available at the time. So I'm looking forward to having the foundation ready for you all, and then to support the decision-making process as best we can.
Any further questions, comments? Does Mr. Peterson have anything further, Ms. Heater?
Just wanted to confirm, just because of the chat from Mr. Carroll, Chet, just to confirm, this slide that you're showing, this is the complete list. Is that correct? There's nothing to scroll down to see other projects.
That's correct, Ms. Heater. This is just the sample list, and I think it was 15 projects. This is just what's going to be used to test the process itself.
Mr. Chair, I expect that this list will probably be much larger when we get the final listing in.
Oh, for sure.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Peterson.
Yes. Okay. I agree with everything Mr. Parsons. I think they're doing a great job. I guess my concern is this fiscal year is coming to a quick end, and we have not completed setting up these processes. Is it our intent to just sit on the funds that have already been collected, or do we need to look at maybe a initial year distribution of the regional funds in a manner that is equitable, or do we just sit on them and hold them for future use? And I think the general consensus is we ought to be taking some action to get initiated, but that's where I was going with this.
Mr. Parsons, do you have any comment?
Mr. Chair, I don't really. I think you could certainly, I think the funds, there's no harm in holding the funds, but I understand Mr. Peterson's concerns.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, this is Mrs. Heater. I mean, I think it's the prerogative of the authority to determine whether you want to have a framework that phases the prioritization. So if there's a priority to expend the accumulated regional dollars and allocate those to projects, to demonstrate movement while the broader regional prioritization framework is developed and implemented, then that's a decision that the authority would make. Absent a decision, staff is continuing to put energy and emphasis on the development of the prioritization process, and presumably holding funds until that process is adopted and we work all the way through that.
Yeah, I just think we need just a few more weeks probably. I think we can get something out of this. And I know that people are becoming a little impatient. I recognize that, but we are starting from scratch essentially here. And so I think give it just a little bit more time, and I think we can actually produce something I think that we can be proud of. All right. We'll now move on to item 9, the CVTA regional project financing. And we'll have Mr. Harris speak to that.
Hey, it's going to take my spot.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the for the opportunity. This is a follow-up item from our last meeting that this committee asked the working group to take a look at, just some broad and initial parameters relative to bond financing, how that may factor into really excuse me, to all the other topics that you all have discussed this morning. So we've got Davenport, who is the financial advisor via our support agreement with CVTA. They took this up and just put together a brief overview. Again, this doesn't constitute any recommendation for any particular number or any timetable for when we would move forward with this kind of effort. But what we charged them with as the working group, and the working group has all had a chance to weigh in on this presentation, was really just, again, to give sort of those things that need to be considered. What are those thoughts that everyone needs to weigh in on, as this enters into the conversation as we move forward. So again, this is just background information. They did a nice job taking a look at how the other authorities have used bonds as part of their mix, looked at the rating agencies and those key factors. But again, it's really just meant to be food for thought. There is no recommendation at the end of this for a specific amount to be issued at any specific date, other than really just to kind of get the conversation started. So with that, unless there's any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy Sanderson, who's going to walk you through this brief presentation, which should have been in your packet that Ms. Heater distributed to everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good morning. Good to see everyone here. Mayor Stoney,
Good to see you, Mr.
you.
Sanderson.
Hi, good to see you. Let's jump, if you would, to really the third page, and this hits on what Matt mentioned. One more page there, if you would. Perfect. What we did was, again, ran some hypothetical borrowing capacity. Go back one page, if you would. It should read hypothetical borrowing capacity at the top. I might have a little bit of a glitch on mine. Are you on that page?
I am. I'm on that for me. Is it showing through? Hypothetical
Yeah, there we
borrowing?
go. Perfect.
Okay.
Yep. And just so what we did here, we took the projected revenues of the authority at 65 million of annual revenues, and translated that into what your borrowing capacity would be. And there are a lot of factors that go into that. And you all see it when your jurisdictions borrow, and I know Mr. Brown has seen it when we work with him in a regional authority as well. And so what we've laid out here on the left-hand side of that table is what your annual debt service payments would be based on certain factors. So the very first line is if our annual debt service payment was $65 million, that would the next column is our coverage. So how much does our annual revenue cover that annual debt service? And in this case, it's one time. So we're assuming that we take every dollar of revenue that we get in on an annual basis and we apply it to debt service. This, just for everybody's benefit, is not certainly something that we would recommend or we think you would do, but this is sort of just the starting point. And then depending on how you structure that transaction, the next three columns have a little bit different scenarios, whether we borrow over 20, 25, or 30 years. We've assumed a level payment, so annually you pay the exact same amount. And then we've assumed some different interest rates based off the term of the loan. So, for example, that very first line, if we were to have annual debt service of $65 million at 1x coverage and borrow over 20 years, we could borrow $883 million. If you move to the right, if we were to finance it over a little bit longer period of time, higher interest rate, we could borrow just shy of $1 billion. Now, the last column tells you what you have left for annual pay-go. And obviously, if we use all of our annual revenue to pay debt service, we'd have zero to apply for annual pay-go, and we'd also have zero cushion if our revenues were to decline in any 1 year going forward. And that's why that one's really untenable. But if you move down the rows there, we go all the way from that $65 million of annual debt service all the way down to zero at the last line, last row there, which is assuming obviously just a cash funding of your projects on an annual basis, that you don't do any financing in that one. But if you just take the middle row there, if we assumed our annual debt service was just north of $21.5 million, that would be a strong coverage at 3 times. So our annual revenue is covering our debt service by 3 times. And we could borrow anywhere from just shy of $300 million to just north of $333 million, leaving $43 million annually that could be used for pay-go projects. There are lots of things that are going to go into this. Again, this is meant to be high level. One of the big things that you're going to want to look at, some key sort of decision factors down there is, what's the minimum debt service coverage that you're comfortable with? That's also going to play into the ratings that we might have with the authority as well. What's the amortization, that 20, 30-year financing? What your liquidity levels are? I think it was Mr. Peterson who asked the question. One of the things that you are going to have to take into account if you are considering borrowing is building up some reserves that will provide the rating agencies some comfort, as well as you, if your revenues were to be lower going forward. Let's flip to the next page if we could. The comparison to other regional authorities. NVTA and HR TAC both have gone into the bond markets. You can see there their credit ratings are very strong, just shy of AAA credit ratings. Their annual revenues a little bit higher than ours, north of $200 million. Their bonds that they have outstanding, NVTA only has $60 million outstanding, and HR TAC has $1.5 billion outstanding. NVTA has gone out and financed their debt over 20 years. HR TAC has gone out even farther and gone out 40 years on their amortization. Both have that 2 times additional bonds test. And again, that sort of goes to that coverage level that we were talking about before. Because you don't have control of the revenues that you bring in, unlike a water, sewer, utility credit where you can adjust the annual rate that the ratepayers pay, you have no control over the revenues coming in. So a credit factor that's going to be there is what's the ability of this authority to issue debt in the future. And so one of the things that we look at is whether you're limited to making sure that your revenues would cover your debt service by 2 times. NVTA has a reserve requirement as well, and both of them have minimum liquidity policies. So they're agreeing contractually that they're going to maintain north of $100 million of cash in the bank, again, to provide some credit quality to investors and the rating agencies. Next page, if you would. I wanted to give you just a oversight a little bit of what the rating agencies look at, and we're not going to go into detail here. I want to just point out to the bottom left, this is really what the quantitative scoring that the rating agencies look at. 3 main factors: what's the tax base and what the pledge is, what's the legal structure, and that's really gets into what do the bond documents look like to the bondholders, and what are the financial metrics of the revenues as well as the legal documents. 2 main things here, which you have control, which you as a board have a control over on how you set up your documents. One is the additional bonds test, which counts for 20% of your score, and then the last one is the maximum annual debt service coverage. Both go to how much is our annual debt service versus our annual revenue that we have going forward. and the ability to issue that additional debt. So I want you to just keep that in mind, that those 40% of this score is within the authority's control and how you set up your documents. The next page, just want to hit on a couple of the borrowing considerations if you were to want to move down that path as opposed to annual funding of your PAYGO. From a timing perspective, you've had a conversation about this already. Project identification and what the spending plan is will be important to lay out. Establishing those key financial policies that we talked about, debt service coverage, projections that we want to limit ourselves to, what our liquidity is going to look like, what the additional bonds test is. And those are things that we would put in an indenture or a bond resolution that would be drafted that we would live with going forward as long as those bonds were outstanding. The terms and structure of the debt, level payment versus level principal, and the duration of the loan, 20, 30, 40 years. The future debt capacity that you're going to have, again, that's important to look at. Again, just the extreme example, if you were to use up all of your revenue on day one to cover your debt service, you would have no capacity to borrow anything additionally going forward, absent some growth in revenue or when your debt service fell off at the end. The credit rating, we talked a little bit about that. That's going to determine what your interest rate is. Again, we would expect this to be a strong credit rating, really depending upon what the appetite of the authority is for borrowing and your expectation on how much you're going to borrow. The last, there are lots of financing alternatives that authorities like this look at. Financing bonds by yourself based on your own credit rating. TIFIA is a program that we use for transportation projects. That would be an option for the authority. You can issue bond anticipation notes in anticipation of borrowing permanently in the future on your own or through TIFIA, for example. But all are things that this committee and ultimately the authority board are going to have to wrestle with and tie in with your spending plans going forward. So, Mr. Mayor, I know that's a lot of information intended to be a high level. So that you can think about these things as you contemplate what projects you want to go to moving forward, but happy to answer any questions of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Sanderson, and thank you for this high-level update and presentation. Are there any questions for Mr. Sanderson or Mr. Harris?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Carlos again, and following up on the conversation we had at the board meeting, Mr. Sanderson, what would be a timing execution? So, for example, you know, if the CVTA board said go, we have a list of projects prioritized. Mr. Parsons and team have said, well, here is a potential funding scenario, and that funding scenario anticipates some level of borrowing. Let's just say it's your 2.0 coverage ratio, which I think is pretty market. What is the timing for executing that transaction?
So you're probably looking 90, 120 days, not 90, probably on the early side since the new credit. We've got to draft the documents from scratch. They're going to be pretty important because you're going to be living with them for a long, long time. So I think that would be the absolute minimum. And it could be 120, 180 days probably. On the more realistic side.
Right. So in theory, if the commission were to, if the board were to make that decision June, July, you could have bonds on the street January, February, in theory.
Yeah, I think you could do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Any further questions? Mr. Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question, Mr. Sanderson, would that timeline include the credit rating applications and that process? Would be simultaneous with that planning and rollout? That's
right. I mean, as long as I think you've got your spending plan and how that's going to work, I mean, that's a very important part of this because it's going to play into what the future is going to look like. And as long as that's set and you guys are comfortable with it, then it's going to be just a matter of pulling together the bond documents, which is a big part of it, negotiating those, bringing on underwriters that may be part of it, and then going to the credit rating agencies. I mean, one of the things we thought about was how much track record do we need of the authority to demonstrate our revenues and that they're going to be there going forward. This isn't a these aren't new revenue streams. So we think that we could obviously just go back and use some historical revenues that would have come to the authority and use those when we're having conversations with the rating agency. So it's not like we have to wait for the authority to be in place for 1 or 2 or 3 years to demonstrate that history. We can use the revenue stream that was there anyway for that purpose.
Thank you.
Mr. Peterson, have a question?
You are unmuted.
Okay.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Mr. Gregory?
Thank you. Would the authority is it being fairly new still is accumulating funds as the revenues come in. And there is a desire among members to go ahead and start spending those funds as they've come in on the regional projects. Would it benefit the authority in the credit rating process and the bonding process to accumulate some funds, some cash on hand? Would that play into that process?
It would. Obviously, there's when you're dealing with a credit that you have no ability to increase your revenues by just the decisions of the board, reserves are going to be a big part of this. And so the extent you can accumulate your own funds is one way to take care of that. There are other ways that we can do it that may cost the authority a little bit more, but we could borrow reserve funds as well and set them aside. So debt service reserve funds, we have those with utility credits often, and there are ways to do it. But that adds to your borrowing costs and really lessens what you can borrow that can be applied to projects. So to the extent you can set aside funds as they're coming in as your reserves, you're going to want to have reserves anyway, just from a cash flow perspective, even if you were to do PAYGO projects. That obviously would help on the credit side and may reduce your borrowing costs because you're not having to do any borrowings for debt service reserve funds.
Thank you. One more quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes.
Would it behoove the body, the authority, to start developing their reserve requirement and minimum liquidity policies in the coming month or two, just to start preparing for that?
Yeah. I think it's one of those things where you've got to marry it a little bit with what your expectation is on your project. So if you as a body look at your projects and there are ones that you plan to fund on a PAYGO basis, then your reserves and these types of decisions are less than if you're trying to fund it. I mean, HR TAC went one complete opposite way than the Northern Virginia authority, and both built up pretty significant reserves from a liquidity perspective. So, but I think you've got to tie them in once you get an understanding of your projects, and the board has some basis for at least being able to provide guidance to staff that this is what we expect our plan is going to be. Might not be fine-tuned, but then staff can come back and make recommendations as to what those minimum liquidity levels should be or could be if you want to get a credit rating within a certain range.
Thank you, Mr. Sanderson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I can just piggyback off of that, I think what I'm hearing Mr. Sanderson say is the first decision that the board has to make is, are we going to approach this from a PAYGO perspective, or are we going to look to leverage and finance? And from that decision will cascade kind of our course of action. To Mr. Peterson's point earlier, we can definitely, we have shovel-ready projects. We could just decide to distribute dollars to support those projects in the near term. But that's going to limit what we're able to do based upon the availability of funds, and likely would push out the concept of a bond offering maybe 12 months if we were to do that. Versus if we were to say that we are going to, the intention is to bond because we want to hit, 10 items on that list versus hitting the top 2 or 3 in 2022, then we would, carry forward the dollars that are accumulated. We would, set up reserve requirements such that we could issue the bonds in 22 and be able to start executing, again, 10 or 12 projects on the list. But it's really an issue of philosophy. I don't think any answer is right or wrong. But what I would say is, because we do have 9 jurisdictions, I believe, in total, the ability to impact all 9 jurisdictions on a pay-go model will be very, very challenging. Versus if you were to bond, there is the ability to ensure that every jurisdiction is touched and impacted in a significant way by projects in the very early life cycle of the authority. Last comment I'll make is, although in fairness, Mr. Sanderson, it will be a lot of work to build to set up the indenture or bond resolution and to market the product. The reality is that the market's going to be somewhat familiar because the revenue sources are very familiar based upon our HR TAC and based upon Northern Virginia's Transportation Authority. So when you go to the street with this deal, although it'll be a new authority, the reality is they'll be familiar with the model that exists here in Virginia, such that, because essentially these are state revenues that are being redirected to a regional area. So I think that, similar to the presentation we had last month at the broader board, we will be able to plagiarize quite a bit of the work that was done by the HR TAC and by Northern Virginia. Is that fair, Mr. Sanderson?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair, Mr. Brown. Lawyers like to copy documents all the time because they're tested, and that works out really well. I think a big part of it will be what are the expectations going forward as to what the projects that the authority is going to take on, and in particular, I mean, the determining what the additional bond test is going to be for you will be a limiting factor going forward on what projects you can move forward into a bond issue. So, I mean, that's going to be the one where you've got to be able to understand as a board, if we just pick one, if we pick an additional bond test of 2 times, we want you to understand up front that that's going to mean you're going to only be able to borrow up to X, and that means that the rest is going to be pay-go. And how does that fit into the projects that you as a region want to take on? And how are you going to be able to do them? When are you going to be able to do them? And then you can make that decision up front, and then investors know as well on how it's going to play out going forward. So those are really the things that I think from a time perspective, it isn't the drafting of the documents. It's more the decision as a governing body that this authority is going to make as to what projects we have. You're now telling us that we have these limiting factors on us if we borrow. And what does that mean for us as a body in doing projects over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Any further questions?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to speak up so much, but I just, as part of that process and as the authority considers these questions and the philosophical debates ensue, as Mr. Brown mentioned, one important point to make is we're grateful to and benefiting from the advice that we're getting from Davenport through our financial relationship with Chesterfield County. If the authority wants to consider bonding, then I would recommend that the body issue an RFP to obtain a financial advisor of its own, so that that's compliant with the Virginia Public Procurement Act. We've already received sort of informal proposals, if you will, from Davenport and PFM earlier last year. And so if that's under consideration, and certainly it is, then I would recommend that the Finance Committee consider recommending to the full authority to direct staff to start preparing an RFP, just so we're ready if and when the authority directs staff to proceed with this. We're ready with a financial advisor poised to take on that responsibility.
And thank you, Mr. Gregory. That is something that I was going to consider in the next item on the agenda. But do we have any further questions here for Mr. Sanderson or Mr. Harris? Thank you, Mr. Sanderson. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, I have your slide ready, so you just let me know when you'd like me to queue it up, but I think you're probably going to do some more conversation with the committee first.
That's correct, Ms. Heater. I'm going to say a few things first, and then we can get into that. During the April CVTA meeting, and even in today's meeting, we have been presented with information that really looks into what CVTA could look like in the future. I wanted to bring a couple of items to the table for discussion. So as the CVTA TAC, through its regional priority subcommittee, continue to work on the eligibility and prioritization measures, our respective administrators have met and recommended the Fall Line Trail as a regional priority. And I believe that with regional lists of projects ranked by project type recommended by the TAC, we could utilize FY 2021 funds in a manner that would be a good regional investment and a good way to put our regional dollars into action while we are in a pay-as-we-go status. Or are we going to move toward a bonding scenario that moves fiscal year 2021 money into a reserve account of some sort? So with that, I just posed a question to the committee on which route people might be thinking about at this moment.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thornton.
Yeah, one of the things I did want to say is that
and Mr. Thornton, can you get closer to the mic or something? I'm having a difficult time hearing you.
Can you hear me better now?
Not really, but.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Is everybody else good with hearing Mr. Thornton?
Everyone else here?
All right, go right ahead.
Okay. My point was that, the members are making good suggestions, but the other thing is, when we brought the other two groups to visit the CVTA last month, remember now that each group is different. So therefore, we talk about each will be customized. And so I always think we want to make sure we go in an expeditious way, but not too fast, as we're going to go in this new direction of how we're going to do the funding, the bonding, what have you. And also, we've had other groups to meet. I think we've had some of the other groups that normally will meet and bring suggestions to us. And I think a group met recently that's going to share some information with us about that. And so one of the things we want to do is at least to hear what that suggestion is from some of those administrators that might be helpful. There's been a guideline for us in the past. But I just wanted to bring forth the idea now, although we see that we can use some instruments that each group like ours, this CVTA, is going to be customized. So ours is not going to look exactly like someone else's. It's going to look like the best that we can vote. So I just want to make sure I put that on the table, because that's very important as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Carroll, do you have anything?
I think this is all important discussion, important debate. I think that, any decisions that we collectively make to move forward on the bonding, I think, if I understood the presentation correctly, we're going to have to come up with what we want to do with the money first, a project list, and then determine what we're going to have to keep in reserve, and determine what our desire is as collectively to go forward in a bonding method. And I think that discussion is something that is not only needs to be held by the members that sit on this committee representing the jurisdictions, but I also think each one of us has to have that conversation. At least I will with my other board members, because I know there are other debt capacities elsewhere that transportation wise that we look at. So I think it's something we need to discuss, move forward with, and really, quite frankly, it's going to make it very difficult to move forward on any of the projects if we don't find out what direction we want to go in. So good conversation today.
Mr. Peterson, I know you're on mute, but I'm sure you may want to contribute here.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I'm unmuted now. So I think we've had a great conversation, and there's no question that we're going to need to have bonding capacity as we go forward. To do that, we definitely have to have reserves. But I'm not too sure that we have to put everything in one direction. If we're talking the PAYGO projects we're talking about, PAYGO doesn't necessarily mean we have to go out and spend the money. It might be using those funds as leverage to leverage other funds, such as your smart scale. We may be that we have been falling behind on because we didn't have enough local funds and CVTA funds. So I think maybe we need to seriously look at doing both of these things, building reserves at the same time. We're also need to be an action group of not just sitting here waiting to see how much money we can accumulate to be able to see how many bonds we can get when we have projects that we can use some funds for leverage early on to get them going while we're still building reserves at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Brown, you want to add anything?
I think I've kind of said my part. I like the idea of PAYGO. I'm generally fairly conservative approach to financing projects, but what I realize here is that there are two things we're balancing. One is the ability to have an immediate impact because dollars have been accumulating. But the other is we want everyone to feel that they were inclusive. And I really commend Chairman Thornton, and he has been relentless in sharing that, we have to make sure that we are thinking about the smaller jurisdictions. And so to the earlier conversation, if we Fall Line Trail, part of what I talked about is that I think that I can bring another $35 million over and above the funding scenario that was recommended by staff at VDOT to the Fall Line Trail this year, right? Leveraging some support from the localities on the call. And that'll be great for the Fall Line Trail, but that's not going to impact 5 of the jurisdictions. And so how do we have enough dollars in the near term to actually touch all 9 jurisdictions? I think that's going to be very challenging in a PAYGO. And to Mr. Peterson's point, there may be a way to kind of split the baby here a little bit. I think, of course, all the regions, all the jurisdictions are getting their local allocation. And so, that although it's local money, it's also regional money. So in theory, that could be leveraged to kind of help support Fall Line Trail. I think that's the direction that the 4 jurisdictions are going to be moving in. But I'm just definitely afraid that if we do something early, because we want to do something early, because we want to show benefit, but that does not impact the other 5 jurisdictions, it may set us off on a slightly wrong footing with those smaller jurisdictions. And And I'd like to guard against that, whereby if we were to get the prioritization, figure out that we can bond and raise $300 million, now there's enough money to finish the Fall Line Trail, to touch 64, to do something out in Goochland, to do something in Charles City at the same time. And it may be a delay of 6 months, right? It may be 6 months. And whereas we waited for literally a decade on some of these projects, 6 more months may not be too much. And again, I'm speaking of this from perspective as kind of the guy that looks across the region, and I get the calls about, well, Goochland hasn't had a project funded by Smart Scale or any of the regional dollars in X years. And I don't want this to be another data point in that conversation if we can help it.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, and thank you all for, I think this has been I really truly believe this has been a great discussion. And as we have this discussion, we have to consider there will be additional staffing needs in place in order to ensure we are ready to go. I think the presentation by the MVTA and HR TAC was very beneficial. I have for you here a small comparison of the staff of each organization. And if Ms. Heater can share that slide for me, that visual. So I have for you here just a small comparison of the staff of each organization for MVTA, for HR TAC, and where we stand. So let's briefly talk through what are the minimum staffing needs I think we envision for CVTA. And so the couple questions that I have is, are there positions or a position absolutely necessary to prepare us to bond? Or are they all shared or contracted services? And what is the potential timeline are we talking about here? Should we have someone in place in fiscal year 2022? Just a couple questions, I think, just to spark conversation or discussion about our future needs and the direction that we want to go in, that I think is aligned with some of the discussion we've had earlier today.
You are unmuted.
Mr. Parsons? Mr. Parsons?
No, I have nothing.
Mr. Carroll?
I will defer to you and then I'll come back later.
Mr. Thornton?
Well, Mr. Mayor, I want to hear, any suggestions that you may have. But don't forget, going forward, I think that you've got to have the appropriate administrative staff to have a successful organization. And so, so I'm sure we're going to put the best one in place.
I guess what I'm trying to get to here is, do we need, the presentations that were given last week, or I don't know when the last meeting was, but they were given by executive directors, both I think who have a background in transportation, running both of those authorities. The question that we have to answer, as we move forward, do we need that sort of staff, that sort of expertise on hand? Do we need a financial advisor to help us with the bonding step? What sort of staffing do we need to actually get CVTA on par with HR TAC and with MVTA as well? Mr. Brown?
Mr. Chairman, I'll speak up. I believe that a model similar to HR TAC would be appropriate for the CVTA. I'll just be honest, I conferred very heavily with Mr. Page as we were developing the draft legislation and contemplating the model for the CVTA. You compare the two organizations. The MVTA also doubles as their CPO, i.e. our Plan RVA organization. That's not the case with what we're looking at for the CVTA. There, we need someone to help do all the extra work that Mr. Parsons and Ms. Heater have been doing for us with regard to coordinating the logistics of our meetings, making sure that they're staying engaged with the managers and administrators and coordinating all of the services and functions. But that doesn't necessarily require, a huge staff. I think in many ways, a executive director, executive assistant, someone to watch the money, whether you call that a CFO or an accounting manager, probably are the minimums for us to be able to operate efficiently. I think it's been shared with me that although Ms. Heater and Mr. Parsons have been really good about it, the reality is that it is a strain on them to support two complete organizations where there is different leadership, and at times it appears that I believe I spoke with Ms. Page, who had been the recent past chair of the Plan RVA, and I think that concern has been raised by some of the jurisdictions about, are we stretching their staff too thin to the point that maybe some of their needs are being neglected as they're trying to support the stand-up of the CVTA. So my recommendation would be that we would consider explore developing job descriptions for an executive director, executive assistant, and a financial manager for the CVTA to be considered, in the next 6 months, in order for us to be able to drive some of these decisions and do it in an efficient manner. So,
Mr. Brown, is that a motion to move that to the full body?
Well, I wanted to defer to you. I wanted to hear your thoughts. I know you've spent some time thinking about this, so I will not make that a motion as of yet until I hear your reaction to my proposal.
Well, Mr. Brown, I'm in agreement. It's not only just a strain on Plan RVA and their support of us here. It's also a strain, I think, on the staffs of the different localities involved. Obviously, we're trying to build this jumbo jet and fly it all at the same time. And I think if we want to make it actually really fly, using these transportation terms here, we got to have, the pilot and the executive director. We got to have someone who's steep in finance, a CFO or a county manager, and someone to assist them as well. And so, as we explore these job descriptions, I think that we need to have this discussion at the full body level as well. I'm glad that we've taken a look at it. I'm glad we've brought in these presentations from HR Tech and MVTA. But I think if we want to start moving the CVTA forward, as I hear I wouldn't call it impatience from Mr. Peterson, but certainly he wants us to start moving and not just sitting on dollars. Or we got to show the taxpayers that we're utilizing the CVTA in the proper way. And I think the way to do that is to begin staffing up properly. So I would support a motion to move this discussion to the full body, if there is a motion.
Mr. Chair, now I'll comment. Can you hear me?
Mr. Carroll.
You are
So I guess what you're saying is we will not need to retain the services of Plan RVA if we're going to stand up our own staff to essentially run the CVTA. My understanding was when we hired Plan RVA, that's what they were going to do for us. That's part of what the services were that we hired them to do. And so if they're not capable of doing that, then I think certainly we need to look at something else. I think that my staff that's providing the services to the CVTA is doing an exceptional job. So I don't necessarily know that that's something that needs to be replaced, but that's certainly something that can be discussed. I can't speak for anybody else's staff as to whether or not it's a strain on their jurisdiction. But I thought that certainly that what our people have been doing for the CVTA has been exceptional. But so, that's, if you're going to talk about this, then we need to look at it across the board. Does that mean that we also need to have different legal counsel? I mean, are we going to basically stand up an entire different organization staff and not need Plan RVA? Or is it going to be a blend? I think that's part of what the discussion would have to be, considering that right now, the administrative budget now that we have in place is essentially to support Plan RVA. And you're probably looking at a big number, an additional cost, if you do hire an executive director, an executive assistant, because I imagine that those positions are not going to, someone who may be interested in working in those positions, it's not going to be cheap. So you're taking taxpayers' dollars away from transportation to stand up staff for an organization, which I thought we hired people to do that already. So I think it's worth having the conversation within the organization to see where it fleshes out.
And Mr. Carroll, I would say that I do believe that our staffs, our respective staffs, have been doing an exceptional job as we added an extra burden to their plate. And also, I think Plan RVA has been doing a great job as well. But I think for me, where we need to go was crystallized by the presentations from MVTA and HR TAC last week. I think, there is still capacity for CVTA to participate, through contracted services or share some sort of, and we can still use our staff for certain shared services as well. So I think there's multiple ways that we can skin this cat. And I think that's why it's worthy of discussion. Ms. Heater, do you want to speak to, you all's capacity or?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that invitation. And I also wanted to say, I think that the graphic or the table that you have provided and put on the screen is also really helpful to the discussion. Mr. Thornton's comments about figuring out how to forge the CVTA direction, maybe informed by the experiences of Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, but really figuring out what works best given our capacity and needs, it makes a lot of sense. I would agree with Mr. Brown's comments that, and I am very appreciative. I think all of our staff members are very appreciative of the kind remarks that each of you have continued to give over the last 9 months. But the reality is we took on this work without an increase in our staff, as did personnel in Chesterfield and in Richmond. And I think it certainly would be our intention at Plan RVA to be able to continue to provide support to the CVTA in any way that is appropriate, but we do need to address our own staffing needs. We've spoken with you previously about the notion that if an agreement were to be approved by the authority for continued support services in fiscal year 2022, that we would move to increase our personnel in hiring an additional person. In practical terms, it would replace Nicole, who you all have I think been appreciative of. I think also depending on the direction, and as this conversation has unfolded today, there is a need for what I would refer to as an executive level support to be able to maintain the activities of the CVTA, just as Mr. Brown suggested. So we would certainly be willing to work with the CVTA in any way to mimic similar arrangements that the HR TAC and the HR PDC have in place. As you know, the HR TAC itself actually has very few employees and relies on the Planning District Commission and the TPO through agreement to have additional support services. I think we would be positioned very well to mimic something like that, or to kind of modify as it fits here in the region, to augment services that have already been established through the financial management and the financial review services. But I don't think that just candidly speaking, particularly if there is anything short of a pay-go model, Plan RVA is positioned with its current staff capacity to manage that. I think there are lots of options on the table about how, if you'd like to preserve the efficiency that Mr. Carroll talked about, I think I'd like to be considered in that discussion, but it cannot continue to be Mr. Parsons, myself, and Ms. Mueller, because we already have, as Mrs. Page maybe communicated to Mr. Brown, commitments that need to be fulfilled with the organizations that we are, primarily responsible to. So I hope I'm not muddying the waters, but I think that I would echo that while we're appreciative of the kind comments this year, we do recognize that our staff composition would need to change and needs to do so quickly, given even the prospect of this morning's recommendation to advance an agreement forward for next year. And I would very much love the opportunity to entertain, participate in discussions about what a long-term staffing arrangement needs to be when we are in a situation of a commitment of a 12-month contract. Rather, it's difficult for us to, position our staff a little bit differently. But I think that there's a willingness to do that if the CVTA is interested.
Yeah, Mr.
And
Chairman,
I'll add, Ms. Heater, that I think that it is truly, I think, our responsibility to maximize the taxpayers' dollars to make something happen for the region. And I think there's an effective way to do that. And the most effective way to do that is you have the expertise on hand to assist the CVTA in growing the CVTA and actually creating some results for the people to actually see. Mr. Brown.
Yeah, and I just wanted to piggyback on Ms. Heater's comments, which I think were very, very appropriate and honest. To Mr. Carroll, we have a $500,000 kind of contract with Plan RVA right now, and I think what you heard from Ms. Heater is that if this was going to be a long-term arrangement, that would need to grow to contemplate the addition of 1 or 2 additional FTEs, which then you've absorbed the cost of what it would take to hire executive director and executive assistants and some type of financial manager. And I agree with you. I think the very jurisdictions and the way that we've arranged things have worked well. I don't necessarily think that you necessarily would need to throw that out if that creates efficiencies and if the respective jurisdictional staffs are able to accommodate and support appropriately. I think you continue that arrangement, but I think you do have to take some of the pressure off of the existing Plan RVA staff with regard to the main functions and support of the CVTA. And the model in Hampton Roads is this, and this is what we thought about with regard to CVTA, is the TPO would continue to do what it does, which is identify projects, prioritize those projects. That system does not have to be recreated by staff at a CVTA with CVTA. However, the execution of those projects, which is something that the Plan RVA and the TPO had never been involved in, the execution of projects, that piece is new and a significant function. And the idea is that you would need additional staff. Now, we can choose to expand the contract with Plan RVA, as Ms. Heater had mentioned, by supporting their adding additional staff. And that's the board's prerogative, but it's not necessarily, I think, the best practice. And I think you're going to spend the money anyway. So I guess coming back to your point, I think the dollars will be the same whether we decide to stay in partnership with Plan RVA in the same way, or whether we decide to hire our own executive director. We're going to spend the same money. I think it's just a matter of us kind of getting to that consideration. So, but I'll before I make a motion, I want to hear from our other colleagues to see if they have any comment.
Is there any further comments on this topic? Mr. Thornton.
You are unmuted.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Chairman, Canoga Peterson here.
Yep.
I don't have the advantage of looking at the graphics that you're looking at there, but if I understood Mr. Brown and Mr. Carroll also, is Mr. Brown was suggesting that we study the staffing needs over the next 6 months. And I'm also gathering that we're looking to recommend going into contract with Plan RVA for the next 12 months or for the next fiscal year. That would give us time, if we followed Mr. Brown's advice, to study what the staffing needs are going to be and what's the best approach is, and still have time left to start actively implementing those things before the end of the memorandum of understanding with Plan RVA. If Mr. Brown would confirm that, if that's what he's thinking, I think that's probably a wise approach, is to take a good, strong look at this. So I'll leave it at that.
And I don't want to put any words into Mr. Brown's mouth, but I don't know whether or not it was an actual study for 6 months. I thought I heard the development of job descriptions for the necessary personnel. Am I wrong, Mr. Brown?
No, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. My proposal was that we would work towards developing those job descriptions with the idea of potentially hiring someone within the 6 month window. I don't think we need to go out tomorrow and post a job, but I think that within 6 months we probably should, have someone, at least at worst, a process identified for hiring someone, but maybe at best, if we all have consensus, actually have someone on board within 6 months. So it's a little bit different, Mr. Peterson. I don't want to study it for 6 months, but I do think that we need to take some time to develop the job description and the roles and responsibilities, and with the idea of within 6 months, either having someone on board or at least starting the process to have someone on board.
Mr. Thorne, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just think that, the judicious thing to do here is we got to plan appropriately, and we're going to need an executive director, and we're going to need to put the structure in place to fit our needs. And so, I just think that now is the time to go ahead and start getting that started. I do recall talking with Mr. Parsons and Ms. Heater, and we don't want to cause them any additional stress also with their job. So they really are doing outstanding service. But it's coming time for the CVTA to have its own structure. So I think this is the time to think about putting it in place.
Okay. With that, thank you, Mr. Thornton. Mr. Brown?
So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to make a motion that we recommend to the CVTA board that the CVTA develop appropriate job descriptions for an executive director, executive assistant, and such other roles as are deemed appropriate, and with the objective that those roles be filled within the next 6 months.
There's a motion on the table from Mr. Brown. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
There's a second from Mr. Thornton. Ms. Mueller, can you call the roll?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
No, I have a substitute motion after we take the vote.
Hanover County. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to unmute Mr. Peterson.
You are unmuted.
Hanover
Mueller,
County.
I would like to ask a question before I vote on this. The initial discussion was to establish these job descriptions in 6 months, but I think the motion says to have these people hired by 6 months. I think if I fully agree with having the job descriptions, and my word study obviously was not part of that. But I think putting the deadline of actually having the hires by that time would make me have to vote no on this.
Thank you, sir. Henrico
Thank you, sir.
County,
Henrico County.
Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Brown, would you be in favor of extending that time?
Yeah, I would, Mr. Chairman. I think as a parliamentarian, I'm scratching here because we're in the middle of a vote, but I would be open to an amendment or a substitute. But if we can go, I'm fine for this to be voted down, and then we can modify it with another motion. That's what we want to do. But yes, I'm open to that.
So I'm looking at the total number of transactions.
So
That's
this
not all this, is that correct? Or it's just,
and I think has a good point there. But I'll support the motion with the ability to be flexible more than just the 6 months.
okay, cool.
Ms. Mueller, did you hear any of that?
Barely, barely.
Yeah, is something wrong with my sound?
It's very faint for me, and you know,
Okay.
I got 40-year-old ears, but I just something's.
40 years are pretty good. Think it's my mic?
I know Henrico County has top quality audio visual, but I'm having some issues with my ears. So.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Gregory.
Now.
Mr. Gregory?
Yes, sir. I just want to make sure everybody's clear on what's going on. There appears to be like sort of some speaking sort of
Yes.
voting going on. So I think Mr. Brown's concerns are well placed. I think I would recommend we resolve the motion that's on the floor first, and then if a substitute motion is desired, as Mr. Carroll mentioned, you could go ahead and entertain that.
All right, let's resume the roll call, Ms. Mueller.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will just summarize. Chesterfield County voted no. Hanover County voted no. And Mr. Thornton, if I could get your vote, please.
Yeah, aye.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
And CTV, Mr. Brown.
Aye.
That is 3 votes aye, 2 votes no.
So the measure is moved?
Yes, sir, that would carry.
So the weighted vote doesn't count on these votes?
Mr. Chair, if I may, the quorum shall consist of a majority of the committee members, which would be a total number of 3. So three would carry the motion, I believe, Mr. Gregory.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the weighted voting is not considered as part of the voting at the committee level. That's only at the authority level. So it's my understanding that the motion would be to recommend to the full body what Mr. Brown recommended in his motion.
So thank you, Mr. Gregory. I guess what I would say, or I would point of inquiry is if Mr. Carroll, and I think I heard Mr. Peterson and Mr. Thornton, if they desired to move to reconsider the prior motion that was adopted for purposes of making a modification, then I would be supportive of that. I guess I'd like to hear what. I'm definitely supportive of the idea of expanding that timeline if that's necessary to get everyone comfortable. I don't know what the nature of Mr. Carroll's substitute would be. But again, we're collegial here, so I don't want anyone to feel like we're leaving any good ideas on the table.
Mr. Carroll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the parliamentarian and myself, usually before there's a vote, there's an opportunity for discussion, which is, I think, what created the problem that we had here. And normally we can have a first and a second and then discussion on that. That being said, that I'm not completely against the philosophy of bringing this to the full board for consideration, both on a timeline and a consideration of what the staff could look like. I'm just not in favor of making a recommendation to the full board that we have to hire an executive director within and put that in place within 6 months. I think this is a decision that the full board should make. And that's my thoughts on that. And so if the motion was to move it forward to be considered by the full board as to what a timeline would look like to stand up staff and what that staff would look like, what the job responsibilities would be, and how this whole thing would work together, we utilizing local financial resources and Plan RVA, that's something I probably could support. But this was more of a narrow focus in reference to what the motion is. And if that doesn't give you an indicator how I'll vote in full committee, I don't know what does. Thank you.
So
Mr. Brown,
again,
comments?
just trying to kind of
All right.
think through this.
Okay, in response, you asked for questions. My concern is not is very similar to Mr. Carroll's here, is the setting the hard deadline of having these people hired within 6 months. I do agree with having the job descriptions and staffing established by that time, but I think we need to look at the whole year to be able to, by the time we get those, then we have to have time to get out and recruit and find the right people. And to put it on a 6-month deadline, I think is being overambitious.
Point of inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brown.
So Mr. Peterson or Mr. Carroll, I'll address this to either of you. I guess the rationale for putting the 6-month line out there was that, and again, the thought was that 6 months to get the descriptions and all that stuff done, and it might take longer to recruit. But what I didn't want to do is run the risk of, especially in light of Ms. Heater's comments, that we would go into next fiscal year without appropriate staffing in place. And of course, if we were to make the decision that we're going to do bonding and all those other issues, that workload that would come with that would be crushing, I think, to the Plan RVA staff, as you've heard Ms. Heater discuss. So the timing piece was just to say we can't let this thing drag out forever. But I'm not tied to 6 months. I just realized that we also can't leave it open-ended to the point that it's indefinite. So is there a compromise target date? I mean, I always believe that you have to hold everybody accountable by setting deadlines and targets, and I don't think we should leave it open-ended. So is there an alternative timeline or target that you would propose?
Mr. Gregory, I saw you.
You are unmuted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to step out of my lane, and I hesitate very much to do so. But
I imagine this is an advisory.
Yes, sir. So I might suggest the body consider requesting that staff provide a staffing plan to the Finance Committee that would incorporate a process moving forward to identify the staffing needs, which I think is pretty well accomplished, but provide some meat on those bones, include job descriptions and also budgeting that could fill out what your plan might be going forward. That then could be part of the Finance Committee's report to the full body and a fuller recommendation. I know that might take time, and I don't want to put any burden on anybody. Certainly would be additional work for everyone, but that's might offer a compromise path forward to accomplish something, and then have a fuller plan going forward. That could, a report could be created. I don't want to speak for Ms. Heater or Mr. Parsons or Ms. Mueller, but it seems to me a staffing report could be formulated within the next couple of months for recommendation to the full body, perhaps in July, and then you would have that to work on as the new fiscal year unfolds. Just a suggestion.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carroll.
I mean, I would also offer up our HR department as it has been utilized many other times in the past to help develop these job descriptions, to work with Plan RVA so that they wouldn't be completely saddled with this themselves. And I think because I know, and we've heard from them, from Plan RVA in the past, that they did need additional staffing for them, that they couldn't handle this on their own. So we don't want to keep something in place that doesn't have the capacity to be successful. And so again, I'm not against having this something put in place to say this is what we think we will need to be able to accomplish the mission, and have the job descriptions put in place, and what the appropriate staff may look like for us as an organization, and that may end up being similar to HTAC, may not be. But if we're going to enter into a contract with Plan RVA for another year, then I would suggest that we would make sure that we have it done in plenty of time, so that if a contract is going to expire, we have the ability to stand something else or additional resources in place. Because essentially, I think we were looking at signing for another year, if I was correct on that.
Right. So Mr. Carroll, I guess my question was, so the motion that will be advanced to the board would be the prior motion, which was within 6 months. If I'm gleaning from your comments, what I hear you saying is, well, you do agree that it should be done. If we're going to hire staff, we should do it before the new contract year starts. So are you open to modifying or amending the prior motion that was adopted to set a 12-month timeline? Is that what you're suggesting? Or I'm trying to figure out whether or not we need to modify the prior motion that was adopted.
Well, I think the conversation we just had, I think that Mr. Gregory brought up about having Plan RVA work on what they believe the staffing needs would be based on what they've been doing for the last 12 months. I guess it's going to depend on how quickly they think they can do that. If they want to work with our HR department to help develop what they believe would be job descriptions, and if they think they can do that in 12 months or even 9 months, then that's fine. But I think if we're going to have that contract in place with them for a year, I think we would hope to have that done within 12 months.
So would you like to modify the prior motion or no?
I was going to have Ms. Heater speak to that real quick. Ms. Heater?
Yes, and mindful of the hour, in thinking about the motion as I understood it, and I think Ms. Mueller, it might be helpful to have you reread that motion that was adopted. But my understanding from that was that a motion would go forward to the full authority that would open this discussion to the full authority to, I think, unearth the highlights of the conversation today, that the future needs of the authority do need to be addressed in staffing, and that it would be wise to formulate position descriptions that would describe the near and longer term anticipated needs of the authority as it relates to the staffing, and that the idea would be that a staffing plan be ready to implement, if not, recruitment, already moving well ahead on that path within that 6-month time period, so that, treatment, I think fair treatment of Plan RVA in this process, and also, frankly, fair treatment of whoever those members of personnel might be onboarding. My recommendation would be, Mr. Carroll, that we do rely on the expertise of the HR roundtable. That has been a very effective resource in the past in identifying key leadership positions in the region, and I think we would include that. Our agreement that you have recommended to the full authority today does include within our scope, I think, being able to provide support to this very conversation and moving it forward. So we are positioned, and Mr. Gregory, I don't think you were overcommitting us at all in that regard. So I think the question at hand is, from my perspective, we could move this discussion forward at the staff level between now and the full authority meeting later this month, be able to provide a little bit more context. I don't know that we'll be able to convene the HR roundtable before the end of May, but I think we could at least begin those conversations. And we've already alluded to the fact that the CAOs and managers are meeting, and we are in regular contact with the TAC members. So I do think we could do a lot of fact finding between now and certainly your June CVTA meeting to be able to keep that motion moving forward and continue the momentum. But I hear you that you may not want to obligate yourselves to a recruitment strategy before the other steps have been put in place. So I just, for whatever that's worth, I think we're positioned to do what's needed to do on the timeline that you've talked about.
Thank you, Ms. Heater. And I guess I would add by saying it's fair to say there are enough people, a lot of people meeting to make the motion that has been carried to the full body happen, making it a reality. So I will say as the chairman, I'm comfortable with the motion as it stands. Is there any further discussion? Because it is now 2 hours into this committee meeting, and the hour is getting late. So I'd like to move on to the agenda, to the other parts of the agenda and new business.
You are unmuted.
Mr. Chairman, I'm unmuted now. If there's still no problem with stuff now that I'm sitting still, I would request to stay unmuted. Are you still getting feedback?
As long as we can prevent the feedback, it's fine.
If you're not getting it now, you won't, because I'm parked.
All right, perfect.
Mr.
All right,
Peterson,
now,
mute yourself on your phone. That will stop the reverb that we're getting.
yeah, we are getting some
Okay.
feedback. Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Chair, what I would say is for the sake of moving forward today, any and other all comments that I may have on this particular issue, I'll take up in full committee.
Sounds good. Moving on to now new business, item 11, the draft memorandum of agreement. Mr. Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, before you on your screen and in your packets is the draft MOA between the CVTA and the member jurisdictions. This is a template agreement, which we developed based upon the GRTC MOA, which was discussed a number of times. And the idea with this is that it will be an agreement, a template that will be utilized for every jurisdiction. We'll try to keep it as consistent as possible across the jurisdictions. The only variation that I think reasonably needs to be considered is the arrangement between Hanover and Ashland that may require a couple of clauses for customized clauses to allow for the flow of funds between those two jurisdictions. Other than that, I think we're going to work on having the same agreement in place with every jurisdiction. To that end, we have distributed this draft template to the legal counsel for all the member jurisdictions. They've had it for about 2 weeks now. I've received comments back on this initial draft from Henrico County, and those suggested revisions were well taken and have been implemented in a new draft, which will be circulated going forward. I expect further input from a couple of the other jurisdictions by the end of this week. And so that's moving ahead, along with the annual certification instrument, which we discussed earlier. The MOA is sort of the front end of the compliance matrix, and the certification instrument is sort of the back end with the quarterly reports and then annual reports from all the jurisdictions and GRTC being built in throughout those two, or between those two bookends in the annual cycle. So that's moving forward. Happy to entertain any questions. In the interest of time, I'll stop there, and happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Gregory? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to Item 12, the fiscal year 2022 insurance coverage renewal. Ms. Heater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Ms. Heater, is there any way that we can be somewhat brief on this topic?
Yes, sir. This matter is only before you because when you approved the solicitation and selection of Versa this past winter, you wanted the opportunity to review the renewals. Not only is it within budget, but it is less than, far less than budgeted. I spoke with Versa this week and confirmed that this is the entirety of the renewal for the annual premiums. And where this current fiscal year, you purchased not only cybersecurity, but the general liability coverage. This is inclusive of cybersecurity coverage. So it's good news all around, and just wanted to make sure that we honored the committee and the authority's request to be able to have the opportunity to review and take action. If you are desirous, you can either authorize staff to execute the renewal, or we can put it on the agenda for the full authority.
Any comments for Ms. Heater?
I'll move for approval.
I second that.
There's a motion to approve and it's been seconded. Ms. Mueller.
Yes, thank you. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Monroe County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr.
Henrico
Thornton.
County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Mayor
City of
Stoney.
Richmond, Mayor Stoney.
Aye.
Aye.
CTB, Mr. Brown.
CTB, Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes the
Thank
roll
you. That
call.
concludes the roll call.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller.
Thank you, Ms. Mueller.
We'll now move to other
We'll
business.
now move to other business.
Future meeting topics. Any topics that any members would like us to pursue in future meetings? Seeing that, we'll move to item 14, CVTA Finance Committee member comments. Any comments from the members?
Yes, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Thornton.
I want to let everyone know that on May the 24th, that the topic of my town meeting will be the CVTA, and I couldn't get any better presenters than the one who are tasked for that. That's Ms. Martha Heater and Mr. Chet Parsons. Just want to let my colleagues know about that.
Awesome. Any further comments? All right, item 15, the next meeting of the CVTA will be June 9th, of the Finance Committee will be June 9th, 2021. Hope to see all of you there. And item 16 is adjourned. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved, motion seconded. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Great meeting.